Welcome to my world history notes, my thoughts on the Cold War. Um, this is just my opinions, things I'm learning, new things every week, and some things I knew already, but many things that I'm finding out that are just astounding to me, and definitely increase my feeling of what happened, what went on, and why we're where we are today. So this is events right after World War II and the decades after. So I want to discuss some things today. First, one of the things about Stalin's Russia, his Soviet Russia, communist Russia, socialist Russia, that's important for us to understand is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Russian dissident, was speaking in 1976, and I found some of his comments, and he had noted that pre-revolutionary executions by the Tsarist government, he figured they came to about 17 a year. And to compare, the Spanish Inquisition, some historians claim, killed 10 people a month. But in the revolutionary years of 1918 and 1919, the Cheka, which was the secret police of the Soviets, executed without trial more than 1,000 per month. Now, when you get to the height of Stalin's terror in 1937 and 38, tens of thousands of people were shot per month. Now, Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which you should read, um, he put it like this: um, 17 a year, 10 a month, more than 1,000 a month, and then more than 40,000 a month. So it made it difficult. How could the democratic West form an alliance with pre-revolutionary Russia, which by 1941 had grown to such a huge extent? But the democracies of the world, England, France, United States, Canada, other smaller countries, how could they enter into a military alliance with such a beast? How could you explain it? Now, yeah, we wanted them to defeat Germany. Certainly, what, 8 of 9 divisions, 8 of 9 dead German soldiers were killed on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union lost 20 million people. And yes, that's a tremendous, but that doesn't account for the end of the war when we wanted them to declare war on that. When they declared war on Japan at the very end and did very little fighting, we still gave them a tremendous amount of material to do nothing. They used this against us in the Cold War. So that's one of the things that I thought was interesting. Another thing I want to talk about today is the CIA. You know, when Wild Bill Donovan, head of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which I pointed out was riddled with communist agents, was hoping that the OSS could continue, and that President Truman, would create a CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, but there's a fear on Truman's part that Donovan's plan for a national intelligence service sounded like the Gestapo, the Nazi Gestapo. So 6 weeks after he dropped the atom bombs on Japan, Truman fired Donovan and ordered the OSS to disband in 10 days, September 20th, 1945. So America's spy service was abolished. Now, you had people like Alan Dulles, who was the ranking OSS officer in Germany, um, and he had he's had a lieutenant, Richard Helms, who also became a head of the CIA. They began trying to spy on the Soviets. Um, and Helms would later admit that he said, what you have to remember is, this is a quote I read in the book, is that in the beginning we knew nothing. Our knowledge of what the other side was up to, their intentions or capabilities, was nil or next to it. If you came up with a telephone book or a map of an airfield, that was pretty hot stuff. We were in the dark about a lot of the world. So they didn't even, our government wasn't even aware, except for the people like the FBI that was focusing on the communists, and congressmen like Martin Dies. Our government was totally clueless as to what we were up against. Now, Richard, by the way, Helms had been a 23-year-old wire service reporter. He interviewed Hitler in the 36 Olympics. And he was just knocked for a loop about the stopping of the OSS. So anyway, they they envisioned that there would be a central headquarters for American intelligence, but only a skeleton crew would be allowed to stay overseas. So Helms could not believe what we were up against, that Truman was willing to just cancel that whole thing. So the Brigadier General John Magruder, who will be important later, he believed that without an intelligence service, America's new supremacy in the world will be left to blind chance or dependent on the British. So on the 26th of September, 6 days after President Truman signed away the OSS, Magruder talked to Henry Stimson, who the Secretary of War. He'd resigned that week, and Stimson had been dead set against the idea of a CIA. And he told Donovan that it would not be advisable. Now, Stimson was gone, so Magruder sat down with Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, according to one source, and they countermanded the president. So that day, supposedly, Magruder walked out of the Pentagon with an order from McCloy that, quote, the continuing operations of OSS must be performed in order to preserve them. That piece of paper kept the hope for a central intelligence agency alive. The spies would stay on duty under a new name, the Strategic Services Unit. McCloy then asked his good friend Robert Lovett, the Assistant Secretary for Air War and future Secretary of Defense, to set up a secret commission to plot the course for American intelligence and to tell Harry Truman what had to be done. Magruder confidently informed his men, according to one source I read, that, and here's the quote, keep this in mind, the holy cause of central intelligence, unquote, would prevail. So we'll talk about more of that next time. But I want to talk about something else on the timeline now. Now, this is really interesting, and I was not aware of this in its fullness until I began studying. On September 10th, 1949, the Indonesian Navy was formed. So its role was to patrol. Indonesia has a lot of islands and has a lot of coastline, and but when you look at where it came from as far as its history goes, it began at the outset of the Indonesian National Revolution. Now, this is interesting because the Netherlands, which had been crushed by Germany, by Hitler during World War II and occupied, wanted to take over their oil-rich former colony, the Dutch East Indies. They were brutal. They were just both sides were brutal, but they were brutal as from their position as far as a colonial power wanting to crush a native people and make them their slaves. The problem with colonialism set the stage for these countries, these third world countries, to look to communism when they couldn't get help from America to throw off the shackles of Dutch or French control or British. When they couldn't get that help, they looked to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was happy to help. And so these communist activities. Now, I'm reading a famous book, very important book by Frantz Fanon called "The Wretched of the Earth," which Marxists today use as a guide. He's very good. He's very accurate in his appraisal of the situation with colonialism and the brutality of the European rule over third world people. The history bears out what he said. His conclusion and his solution is what's wrong. Communism is a worse chain, a worse burden, even than the oppression of the colonialism. So they're just anyway. The Indonesian National Revolution or Indonesian War of Independence is a very good study, and it will really make you sick about what the European powers were willing to do after the war, the World War II, what they were willing to do to assume control again over the third world peoples. And I'm using a term that Marxists used, but it's common that we understand it to be the non-European countries. So what they were willing to do and how brutal they were willing to be is very interesting. So we'll stop there. These are just my opinions. I know you probably know more than I do about these events, and you have your own opinions, and you may disagree with me completely. If you're a communist, I have no regard for you. If you're a collectivist that doesn't regard individual rights or self-reliance or hard work or traditional morality, marriage, Christian culture, or you know even a traditional religious culture, even if it's not Christian. um, but if you have no regard for that, if you have no regard for the wisdom of the past, if you think everything should be torn down and we should start from scratch, and that we should all be actually, the state is absolute sovereign, nothing but the state, everything from the state, everything for the state, and that collectivism, you believe in collectivism, then you're my enemy. So I really don't have any regard for what you have to say, because you want to destroy human freedom and dignity and the ability of people to prosper and excel and to provide for their families and to make their families' life, their children's lives better than their lives have been. And you deny that. You deny that there's any value in in traditional morality, in biblical morality. Um, you deny that, and I am opposed to you. So let's continue. I'm going to continue to talk about my thoughts on the Cold War. Like I said, this is my opinion. It's not scholarly. You're going to find a lot better appraisals of what I'm saying, other places. Um, but I am very, very much opposed to communism and all its little um, children, all of its little, Marxism, socialism, whatever you want to use. Communism, the ultimate idea from the French Revolution, politically, that the state is the absolute authority, and you'll only have rights that the state is willing to afford you. And and of course, a whole lot more, like Herbert Marcuse. I just finished a study guide for Herbert Marcuse at Cusa, and we've talked about what we're going to talk about more about how Marxism was adapted for the exceptional American situation. But these are just some thoughts on the Cold War. I hope you'll study more in depth. You'll have more to say than I do, and you'll know more than I do. And but I'm having a lot of fun studying this. So I hope that I can share this with you. Thank you.